30 or so minutes. So my name, as Paul mentioned, is Lucien McCaig, and I work for a small company in Byron Bay called ArborMeta. And ArborMeta is an envirotech consultancy that is pioneering a new technology and a new methodological approach to forest measurement and monitoring, primarily based upon LiDAR, which I'll get into later. So Paul invited me here to speak about this technology, which I will certainly do. But before getting into that, I'd just like to reframe the context in which this technology and this approach sits, as straight facts and technical details are not always the best way in isolation to communicate a value proposition. So anyway, let's get started. Climate change, global warming, these are ubiquitous terms in the 21st century, here and now in 2023, but this was not always the case. It was only really at the end of the 20th century that we started to come to terms with the idea that we were doing certain things, conducting certain activities that were emitting certain gases into the atmosphere, and those gases were having a warming effect, whereby they would reflect and trap the heat reflected from the Earth's surface originating from the sun, and in turn were acting in a greenhouse manner, warming the Earth and warming the atmosphere. And those gases are primarily carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides, but also other things like hydrofluorocarbons, the most important of which, particularly for today, is carbon dioxide. So it soon became clear that this was a global issue and something that we needed to do something about. So enter then now the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. This was an international climate treaty established to deal with the problem at what was a global problem at a global scale through international cooperation. So then once it became clear that we couldn't just talk about this problem, we had to actually start doing something about it. The UNFCCC implemented the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which was effectively a Kyoto Protocol to encourage some form of action and to set the path for going forward. And so at this point, it became clear that we faced two major tasks. Firstly, we needed to avoid emitting further greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and if possible, we needed to begin sequestering or removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere into a more benign form, such as a material form on the ground. Now, luckily, some smart person somewhere thought about this for a minute and thought, okay, well, what emits greenhouse gases, but then also has the potential to sequester it, or also does sequester it? The answer, of course, being trees. So our terrestrial giant photosynthesizing friends, when cut down or when burnt or when they decay, emit greenhouse gases, and they grow, they also sequester them. And so just like that, you have the perfect mitigation solution to climate change in the form of nature-based solutions, or trees and forests. So this then led to the implementation of the Clean Development Mechanism in 2006, which effectively provided the framework and the methodological approaches for carbon offsetting globally, particularly in the form of nature-based solutions, but also in the form of other things like renewables and things like hydrofluorocarbons and all those other things that I mentioned. Now, these projects, these offset projects, simply had to operate by a few principles for them to be real and do the things that they were supposedly meant to do. They had to be additional, meaning that the mitigatory activity that you implemented within that project would not have happened if not for the finance that that activity awarded. So, for example, the deforestation in an area the halting of deforestation in an area would not have occurred if not for the finance paid or delivered to that project for the effort of halting that deforestation. There had to be some form of permanence, meaning that the result of that project couldn't just be for the time frame in which it was awarded money, say 25 years. It had to be longer than that. It had to last for a significant and real amount of time, 50 years or optimally 100 years. As an example, in Australia's own carbon market, the permanence period required for the major vegetation projects can be 25 years, though, which is the same period of time as the crediting period, though if you do that, then you receive less credits because obviously 25 years is not a very long amount of time. But if you then move to 100 years, then you are free from any kind of punishment in that sense. So beyond permanence, you had to also avoid leakage, meaning the activity that you mitigated, say the deforestation, couldn't simply move to the area next to that project, because then you're not really mitigating anything, you're just moving the problem elsewhere. And furthermore, the carbon pools that you were targeting, say for the carbon dioxide carbon pool, you needed to be able to quantify and measure those pools properly and with some form of realness and veracity. And then furthermore, to finish it all off, you had to be able to monitor, report, and verify those projects. So this then, in essence, sounded relatively straightforward. Just stop cutting down trees and plant more ones, plant new ones, let them grow. But of course, this was not really the way that things went, or it was not that simple. For the most part, the world and its civilizations were slow to pick up on these schemes and with any real urgency or attention. There wasn't really an incentive to do so. And so for the most part, these schemes and these mechanisms were passed off to the voluntary carbon market under standards like Verra and Gold Plus. And then furthermore, it became clear quite quickly that it wasn't actually particularly easy to do these projects. If you have no familiarity with forestry or forest ecology or geography or ecological science in any respect, then you might think, okay, I'll just take a 400,000 hectare forested area. I'll go in there and I'll do a few plots. I'll collect some baseline data on carbon stocks, and then I'll look at some satellite imagery and I'll check up on it every now and then to make sure that the deforestation that I'm purportedly stopping isn't happening, and I'll talk to landowners every now and then, and it'll be all good and everything will work perfectly, which of course is not the case and very much not how these things have worked up to this point. They're incredibly difficult, and in my opinion, this is where the downfall of these projects has been to date. Am I on the right? I'm not sure if I'm on the right slide. No, all good. Has been to date. The truth is that no one has had good, reliable ground truth data on carbon stocks or other forest-related metrics. Comprehensively performing a baseline in these scenarios, in these big, dense, wild, rainforested areas is borderline impossible, and then monitoring them with any kind of reliability and accuracy is again borderline impossible. Low resolution satellite imagery can only do so much, and then you throw into the mix that again, anything to do with assessment, monitoring, and analysis of these kinds is incredibly laborious and is thus prohibitively expensive. And you've just got a recipe for things not really being done properly at all. And so the truth is that no one has good data that is thorough or reliable. And up to this point, there has been no real incentive to be transparent about this fact because no one's really been checking in on things. It's just been, the carbon market has been its own little world with its own players that have been in their own, effectively, this little echo chamber for the most part. And so although we've had these commitments and mechanisms for the past 2 decades, you know, as I mentioned, the UNFCCC, the Clean Development Mechanism, the Kyoto Protocol, it's only really been in the last decade, and even within that last decade, the last 3 years, that there has been any form of public attention or scrutiny or urgency delivered into these mechanisms and into these projects. But things are changing. The carbon projects and the forests that they represent are under increasing scrutiny, and the public eye is now demanding that they be better. Projects need to become more transparent and be built off better foundations. You know, trust is low, and so is the price of the credits derived from these projects. And if you've got a low price, then for ACCUs, say from REDD Plus or whatever standard or project you like, then, well, firstly, no one's going to be incentivized to do these projects, and then no one's going to pay for the credits, and so the forests are just going to get cut down because deforestation is an almost inevitable fact in many of these places. And then the communities, the local communities who we are forcing and demanding to reduce their emissions and to decarbonize and do all these incredibly costly, expensive things, won't have the alternative economic financing sources that they need to sustain a green future in their lands and on their countries. So what these projects need is they need to be assessed and measured and monitored properly so that they can be reported upon with confidence. They need good, open, accurate, and digital data. So then that there begs the question with trees, and when it comes to trees and forests, how do you collect good data? Well, you measure them properly. So to date, forests and trees haven't been measured properly. We haven't been measuring them properly. Not really. As I'm sure, by the sound of things, Tom was just describing, and I hope I won't speak to the contrary on this, but to date, the way that you would go out and collect data in a forest is a group of people would go out into a forest. They would, with their star pickets and their GPSs, and they would roughly, that have maybe a 3 or 4 degree level of meter error in accuracy, meaning that your plot is effectively 3 to 4 to 5 to, depending on the GPS, up to 10 meters inaccurate, and you don't know where you are. So you would go out into a forest, you would place your star pickets down, you would roughly generate your boundaries, then within that plot and within those boundaries, you would attempt to uniquely identify every single tree, record those trees. You would then need to record the DBH, the diameter at breast height of those trees, the height, perhaps other forest metrics, all the while making sure that you stayed within your boundaries and that you were sure of which trees were inside those boundaries and which were outside of those boundaries, and making sure that you didn't double count and that everything went perfectly. And this is a process that is incredibly prone to human error. And then you throw into that mix the fact that the allometric scaling models, from which the biomass is derived from this kind of data, so you get, for example, your DBH measurement, which is a tape you put around a tree, and then you put that diameter into an allometric scaling model, which is a statistic function, and then you output a biomass estimate, and the thing with these models is that, these scaling models, is that they were not built, the sample data set that was used to construct them did not have, for the most part, rainforest trees in them. And of those rainforest trees, they did not have large rainforest trees, which is where most of the biomass is stored in these forests, meaning that they are not calibrated to these kinds of trees, meaning that you start to get increasingly large amounts of error as the trees get bigger, which is obviously not something you want to do when you're looking at the things that provide the most biomass within a forest. And then add on to this mix the fact that this data is inherently analog, and which means that it cannot be readily and easily and appropriately integrated with other data sources, other digital data sources, which is what people are attempting to do. Now, I have a lot of admiration for the people that have done this up to this point, because forests are not easy places to get into. They're not easy places to collect data in. But that was all that we had available to us at the time. And so plenty of admiration up to this point, and it's led us to where we are now and informed us of where we need to go, but things need to be better. We need data and methods that are better if we want to do this properly. Which then begs another question. What measurement technologies do we have available to us in the 21st century? So firstly, we have satellites, which you probably imagine most of you are familiar with to some degree. So countries, governments, nations, agencies, private companies, organizations of all kinds have hedged their hopes and dreams on satellites and the data that they provide for some time now, because they provide all kinds of data, and they do so at an incredibly broad scale. Once you have a satellite up in the air, which does cost billions of dollars to produce in the first place, you have a labor-free, massively broad-scale data collector that is, in theory, incredibly efficient and cheap at that kind of scale. So what kind of data do you get from satellites? For the most common one is photographic imagery, which you see in Google Maps and what have you, derived from satellites like Landsat 8 with 30 by 30 meter pixel resolution, Sentinel 10, 10 by 10 meter, or Maxar imagery, or Planet, which provide much higher resolution satellite imagery at the 50 to 30 centimeter pixel scale size. But fundamentally, what do you get from satellites? What does a satellite give you? It gives you a pixel with color in it, and that's it, a pixel with a color signature. Now, you might be able to look at that pixel and the pixel surrounding that pixel and think that, okay, well, that looks like a forest. It's green. Though once you zoom in, you're not really sure, particularly at something like Landsat at 30 by 30 meters, you're not sure if that green is a forest or if it's grass or if it's vines or lantana or something along those lines. You just know that it's green. And now, assuming that there is a forest there, and you might be able to determine what a forest is, but it's by no means self-evident that a computer is going to know what a forest is. It's a whole different story. And then once you've looked at that green, at that pixel, you don't assume that there's a forest there. You don't know anything about what's going on in that forest. You don't know what it's made up of, what the trees are like, what's in it, its structure, anything. So in isolation, what that means is that you know nothing really about that forest except for the fact that maybe it's there. And so what that means is that in isolation, satellite data is useless for estimating something like biomass or carbon stocks. People might tell you otherwise, and there are plenty of companies that are, again, hedging their bets on this kind of data, and they will tell you, no, we can perform some fancy modeling on this and with some AI software engineering, and we'll give you biomass, but they're lying and they can't validate those claims. Well then, where does that leave us? the industry has started to switch on to this fact that you can only get so far with satellites and only do so much, and is starting to move towards another data source, a different data source, one that isn't quite so broad scale, but provides a different kind of information and a much more data-rich kind of information. And that platform, its data source, is aerial LiDAR. Aerial LiDAR being LiDAR that is on an aerial platform, say be it fixed wing, a plane, or a drone, which is another particularly common one. And LiDAR being light detection and ranging. And what that is a LiDAR instrument is something that shoots out a laser pulse, which is just photons, and those photons hit an object and are reflected back into that instrument, which then places a point in space in its little digital brain. And once you scan a scene comprehensively with that laser, it generates a 3D digital point cloud replica of the scene that you've just scanned, which you can sort of begin to see up there. And depending on the kind of instrument, you get you can have tens of thousands of points per square meter. But what does aerial LiDAR give you fundamentally? What kind of data do you get? So because of the way that aerial LiDAR operates, you're flying over the top of a canopy at different heights. It can be 80 meters to 400 meters. And shooting a laser pulse directly down into that canopy, you get information on canopy area, things like canopy structure. You get information on canopy height and also on the terrain, digital terrain models underneath. But fundamentally, aerial LiDAR is incapable of penetrating the canopy of a forest sufficiently so that it can place points on the branches and stems of the trees beneath them, meaning it can't see them effectively. And if you can't see them, you can't do anything with them. You can't learn anything about them or infer anything about them. And that is where the biomass is in forest. It's not really in the soils, it's not in the leaves, it's not in the vines, it's in the branches and the stems of forests, of trees. And so again, what this means is that in isolation, aerial LiDAR is incredibly limited in its capacity to estimate biomass and carbon stocks. You can have a go, you can perform some weak modeling on it, but it's not something that you'll do with any form of real accuracy or integrity, which is what we're looking for here ultimately, is integrity and accuracy. So then where does that leave us? That leaves us back on the ground with the only tool capable of getting the job done. And that tool is terrestrial LiDAR scanning. Terrestrial LiDAR scanning captures in ultra-high detail every single stem, branch, twig, vine, and leaf within a forest. By scanning a survey plot with millions of points, TLS creates an ultra-high fidelity replica of that forest and that scene, including information on the understory and the forest floor. And then this is information and data that can be, because it's 3D, can be navigated through, assessed, analyzed, and inspected from all kinds of different angles for all kinds of different purposes. Oh, no, that's too soon. And what you can do once so the big question here is, how do we get good biomass? How do we get our carbon stocks? Now, what a terrestrial LiDAR point cloud allows you to do is perform something called quantitative structural modeling, whereby the point cloud of the stem and the trees allow for, depending on the method used, cylindrical models to be built around those trees, allowing you to ascertain the woody volume of a tree, which when transformed with a wood density factor allows you to estimate biomass, and allows you to estimate biomass with often a 99% or above congruence with the real biomass of that tree, meaning that if you were to scan a tree with TLS, then you were to model it, and then you were to apply a wood density factor to it and get a biomass estimate, and then if you were to go and cut down that tree in real life, and you were to dry it, and then you were to weigh it and see what, in reality, the weight and the biomass of that tree actually was, you would have an error of perhaps around, depending on the tree and the scenario and the modeling and the software, around 1%, which effectively means you're capturing that biomass in truth, which is an incredibly groundbreaking new process in this realm of forest science quantification. Furthermore, a TLS plot is precisely geolocated up to a point of a few centimeters, and every single tree has its own file and is uniquely identified. So what that means is that from one year to the next, you can go back to where you performed an initial survey and collected data on carbon stocks, biomass, other things related to biodiversity, whatever, and re-perform a scan, and you know exactly which tree is which, you know exactly how that tree has changed from one year to the next, you can see the change, and you know which were inside the plot and outside the plot, and you know where your boundaries are because there's something that you can make on the computer that have specific coordinates that you can then apply, again, across time. So it makes resurveying fundamentally reliable, and of course this whole process is digital, so it's now transparent. And furthermore, this data can actually be integrated into other GIS mapping products, standard GIS mapping platforms, as well as other digital data sources, which is where this whole thing sort of culminates to and where things get really exciting in this space, if you're in this space. So fundamentally, terrestrial LiDAR provides the ground truth data necessary to unlock the utility of platforms like aerial LiDAR and satellite imagery in a process that we term multi-scale LiDAR biomass mapping. So fundamentally, your TLS provides the calibration data necessary to inform the biomass within an aerial LiDAR survey with incredibly high accuracy. And so then once that aerial LiDAR, which you can do from, so there's a bit of context, a TLS plot can maybe in a rainforest would be somewhere from 0.2 to 0.5 or even a hectare, so that is quite large. And then in more open savanna woodland situations, a typical plot is about a hectare in size. But aerial LiDAR allows you to collect LiDAR data from tens of hectares to tens of thousands of hectares, so incredibly broad area. And then once you have, for example, 1,000 hectares of biomass calibrated aerial LiDAR data across the forest, you then have an enormous data set, training data set to build a biomass model upon satellite imagery, which then allows you to predict biomass across tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of hectares with incredibly high accuracy. And then once you've built that model, you can validate it. You can validate your predictions with additional terrestrial LiDAR plots because of the geolocated nature of them. So now to give myself a break from talking and you all a break from listening to me, I have a video here which I'd like to play, which I think Tom is going to do, which I guess rehashes a bit some of the things I said, but provides a lot of nice, pretty pictures and graphics and visuals to demonstrate this process, as well as a little case study of data collection research case study that we did over in Papua New Guinea earlier this year, which is a place with a booming, soon-to-be booming carbon market, and where for avoided deforestation, and where technology like this really becomes essential.
All good?
All good.
Greenhouse gas emissions in the Earth's atmosphere must be mitigated and reduced if the climate is to be stabilized. In our collective struggle to meet net neutrality targets, and keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, nature-based carbon offsets are our most powerful solution. This is because trees store by far the greatest share of living carbon on Earth and are critical for a flourishing biodiversity. But with nature-based solutions under increasing scrutiny, the importance of establishing quality baseline and monitoring systems has never been greater. Nature-based projects built on forest and woodland carbon stores can now be measured with definitive accuracy using a layered, multi-scale LiDAR approach. A bottom-up process where precise, geolocated ground truth measurements are passed up the chain of resolution through intermediate steps all the way to the satellite scale. This process begins with ultra-high resolution terrestrial LiDAR scanning, TLS, at the hectare scale. A typical TLS savanna plot consists of a few dozen individual scans arranged in a regular grid that captures all angles of the vegetation under survey. The scanner rotates 360 degrees at each position, capturing the surroundings with millimeter precision. Each tree, leaf, and branch is captured in a 3D point cloud. These data allow the woody volume of each tree to be digitally modeled, which is a crucial step made possible by recent software developments. Assigning a tree species to each tree model allows woody biomass to be accurately calculated across the entire plot. Each processed plot outputs a range of useful data compatible with standard GIS platforms, including stem data, canopy mapping, deadwood detection, height mapping, and many other metrics. After performing terrestrial LiDAR scanning, accurate biomass measurements can be achieved across thousands of hectares by using aerial LiDAR. Aerial LiDAR cannot model woody volume directly, therefore it must rely on a common metric able to be derived by both aerial and terrestrial LiDAR point clouds. This metric is known as shade volume. Shade volume is strongly correlated with wood volume. Once calibrated by TLS, aerial LiDAR shade volume can be transformed into biomass. This common metric and the process of calibration allow carbon sequestration to be accurately monitored at a landscape scale. This process of calibration can be upscaled to an entire project or sub-national area with the use of satellite imagery. Biomass calibrated aerial LiDAR data is used to train machine learning models on satellite imagery, generating expansive biomass maps. Unlike other satellite biomass maps, a map built using this three-stage process benefits from dozens of TLS plots and thousands of hectares of calibrated ALS biomass estimates, resulting in unprecedented accuracy. The rainforests of Papua New Guinea are the third largest on Earth, covering an area greater than the United Kingdom. Home to hundreds of endemic species, indigenous communities, and immense biodiversity, these forests represent one of Earth's most important ecological assets. As one of the world's greatest carbon sinks, the forests of PNG are increasingly attracting interest from international carbon offsetters, investors, and conservationists. However, the difficulties of collecting ground truth data and operating within such a remote location have resulted in a high reliance on remote sensing measurement and subsequently uncertainty about existing forest carbon stocks. As part of a collaborative research effort, ArborMeta was invited to visit the Western Sepik province to work with locals and collect world-first biomass data using terrestrial LiDAR scanning. The team begins by explaining the capabilities of the TLS scanner to the villagers. Mounted to a tripod, the scanner rotates 360 degrees, sending out near-infrared laser pulses. With each rotation, the laser pulse captures surrounding objects in millimeter detail. When performed in multiple positions, these scans can be registered and visualized as a 3D point cloud, which can be processed to extract key forest metrics. Traditional methods of obtaining these forest metrics rely on manual instruments such as tapes and inclometers, which, while relatively effective in open woodlands, struggle to capture the complexity of rainforest environments, particularly on the scale required to form reliable baselines for carbon projects. This issue has given rise to uncertainty and distrust in many carbon offsetting schemes, with investors unable to verify the integrity of the credits they are purchasing. By using TLS, any issued carbon credits are not only measured with a far greater degree of accuracy, but can also be visualized, assessed, and audited in an easily accessible format. Consequently, TLS measurement provides the strongest foundation possible for carbon projects, ensuring the legitimacy of on-ground carbon stocks and safeguarding potential investors from claims of greenwashing. Each day, the team and local landowners head into the forest to conduct LiDAR scans. The heavy equipment is lashed to wooden poles using vines, then carried into the jungle. Once they have arrived at the first survey site, the team shows the locals how to lay out a 1 hectare quadrant using flags and compasses. The team walk to each flagged position in the plot and then conduct a scan, measuring the surrounding vegetation at each position. For accurate measurement, a typical plot will contain over 150 scan positions, with each position adding millions of data points to the resulting point cloud. The woody volume of each tree can then be modeled from this point cloud, allowing biomass and therefore carbon stock to be calculated and visualized across the entire plot. Each tree can also be isolated to provide individual metrics and baseline information, such as stem data, canopy mapping, DBH measurements, and more. The team repeat this process each day for 2 weeks, traveling between the villages and heading further into the forest to collect a representative sample of the prospective forest conservation area. Torrential rain, stinging ants, and thick mud are all a daily norm. But with the help of the local landowners, they are able to successfully conduct terrestrial LiDAR scans throughout the forest. With surveys complete within each forest strata, they return back to the village, where they show the forest point clouds to the local landowners before departing from the mountains, returning to Australia to process the data. By using terrestrial LiDAR to collect ground truth forest data, ArborMeta is able to gather fundamental information for carbon projects, whilst helping educate villagers on the value of protecting their forests for generations to come.
Cool. Well, I hope that provided a bit more clarity or insight into how this all works and what these things look like and some of the cool graphics and modeling that you get out of it. And the key point here, I guess, is that all of this is underpinned and rests upon this technology or something like this, the terrestrial LiDAR component. Without this, this is what replaces those allometric methods and what we've been doing up to this point. And this is what provides the ground truth data necessary to make any kind of other monitoring or analysis or measurement that we want to do possible and reliable and accurate. So I brought in today one of our scanners. This is one of our old ones that you've seen in that, saw in that video, and some of you may have noticed me fiddling around for a while trying to get this on because this is not the tripod that we normally use for this. But anyway, this is what a scanner looks like, and a process I can demonstrate now is to, as you make a project and you click start upon its little screen, and as you'll see it spinning around its laser instruments, the mirror sort of tech within it is spinning around at incredibly high speed, sending out hundreds of thousands of pulses and lines per second, which will then generate a point cloud of this room. And so I'll put it over there next, and you have to place it at different intervals, at different points, so that you get all sides, if that makes sense, of what it is you're trying to scan and trying to see. And I'll get this point cloud from this, and I'll take a screenshot and send it to you, Paul, and you can send it to everyone afterwards. Now, it's worth mentioning that this doesn't just end with biomass and carbon stocks. With TLS, the potential for things like change analysis and biodiversity metrics is just beginning. The things like, oh, you can stay wherever you like. Tom, oh yeah, maybe that's a good idea. Things like deadwood, litter layers, hollowing, disturbance, fire disturbance is all at our fingertips. It's just a matter of the innovation meeting the demand. That's the thing with this data. Once you have it, it's not going anywhere. It's there. You can mine it effectively for eternity and get all kinds of new things out of it to meet whatever it is that's required. And the reason why that this is only just coming up now, why you haven't heard about this, depending on how familiar you all are with this sort of process of forest surveying, is that it's mostly resided in the annals of academia, because these things are incredibly expensive, mind-bogglingly so, but they also require a very high level of software and software engineering and expertise and sort of coding algorithms necessary to transform the data into something usable, and it also requires an incredibly large amount of computing power. But the truth, the fact is that it is now here, and it is now operable and ready to be rolled out at a commercial scale. We can now collect more data more efficiently and more cheaply than ever before. We can build multi-layered measurement and monitoring systems with greater integrity than anything before. And this is how this kind of data, this kind of process, this kind of approach and care to transparency and accuracy and getting the hard work done. This is how we make nature-based solutions. This is how we make nature-based solutions work. This is how we ensure that our climate action is real. This here, something like this is how we save our trees and our forests. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
What an excellent presentation. That was terrific. Thank you.
No worries.
Questions?
Yeah, any
Yeah, what's the cost per
cost per hectare, hey?
Like the entire process from like scanning to...
It's a business question right there. It's funny just because it's a question that we get asked a lot, because people aren't used to doing this, right? People aren't used to having to pay for things properly, like measurement and going about this kind of process. And so the first thing, and that is always on everyone's mind, is how much does this cost? How much is this going to cost me? It's not that I need to do this, it's that, well, if I go about doing this, am I going to break my budget? And the answer is that there isn't a clear answer to how much it is per hectare, because the amount of computing power and labor and processes needed changes depending on the vegetation type. So if you're in an open savanna, then it's quite easy to move through and doesn't need much data. But if you're in a rainforest, you need to do 3 times as much data collection. You need more people, and it's a much more difficult process. The simple answer is that it is cheaper than doing it by the old method with a tape measure and what have you, going through a plot manually with 4 or 5 people. You can collect data with 1 person now with this setup, but and of course the data that you get is much more useful and is effectively incomparable. But in terms of a actual cost per hectare, might range, say for savanna, around $3,000 or more, $3,000 to $5,000. But that's, again, highly dependent on the scenario and the level of analysis that you want to do, whether you're just staying on the ground or you're going up to the air and across an incredibly broad scale. So, yeah. Well, it's the only kind of answer you can really give, because it's so dependent on so many variables.
Nick, so I was involved with the National Forest Inventory of Papua New Guinea, which went for 8 years, cost $22 million US, and they managed about 234 plots across Papua New Guinea, and only in they're relatively easy to access areas. They're still very hard to access, but places you could get to within, say, about 4 to 6 hours walk from where you could get to with a vehicle. So this method is probably at least 4 times as quick.
Yeah, I can speak to that point directly, actually. So that 2 to 3 year period, PNG conducted their National Forest Inventory, which was where they go out, like Paul said, and they collect data on trees and biomass and a whole bunch of other things as well. But within that time frame, they collected data on about 9,000 trees. So that video that you saw where we went over into PNG, and we were there for 2 weeks, and we collected about 13 plots worth of data. I think we analyzed 11,000 trees. So in 2 weeks, we were able to collect data and model and analyze more trees than the National Forest Inventory team was capable of doing by the old methods across 2 to 3 years, with millions of dollars at hand. So,
yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of capacity building stuff and infrastructure that lasted a long time. But yeah, it's much more rapid, and it's when you actually think of the cost in that context, it's likely to be much cheaper. But the product you get, is a data set that you can technically come back periodically, and then you can just make it completely open book for everybody. So if you're trying to prove that you avoided deforestation and degradation and promoted sequestration, then the data is incredibly transparent. No one has to worry about someone making an error with their numbers or
Saying they did a plot when they didn't, in fact.
all of those sort of things. Just a question from Malcolm online. Can you spatially layer the aerial LiDAR with the terrestrial LiDAR data?
Yes, yes. So if I'm interpreting his question correctly, that is the process whereby you calibrate aerial LiDAR for biomass. You can align the points, the point clouds from the terrestrial LiDAR to the aerial LiDAR and see that they match up and that they're seeing the same thing in some sense, though the aerial LiDAR is seeing less. That does require a bit of manual alignment, but then once you've done that, that allows you to generate the necessary calibration factors and metrics to calculate biomass then with the aerial LiDAR.
I have a question actually on the TLS. Do you choose what you're scanning before using it, like on the field? Because, for example, I knew about TLS in archaeology.
Yeah.
It's widely used already to find.
Yeah, in like mining and stuff. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you choosing what you want to scan, or if you're not, you might have bonus data that you didn't expect. That will be useful for other stuff that are totally not related to forestry.
Yeah, we typically focus on things to do with, typically focus on forests when we're collecting our data. And, it's dependent if, say, do we have a client that needs data collected in a certain place, or then we will target the best way to thinking about it maybe to answer this question is that if you're wanting to perform a broad-scale project, multi-scale LiDAR like I've just mentioned there, what you need to make sure you do is you capture the variation within the vegetation on the ground. So not all the trees are all the same, which means that they have different signatures in the aerial LiDAR than in the satellite imagery. And so you need to selectively place just like you would with other plots, older styles, place your ground truth plots, say within different strata, say within different vegetation types. Out in the rangelands where most of Australia's carbon projects are, you get sort of roughly speaking groups of eucalyptus, you get groups of mallee, of mulga, and of cypress, and they all have different signatures, and so they all need to be data needs to be collected on them to inform the higher order modeling so that it knows how to predict the biomass, which changes across all of those things accurately when it encounters them. So yes, we are selective in how we choose to model, and it's usually to capture a representative, it's how we survey it and to capture a representative sample of the area in question.
Up the back, Mark.
Have you compared the carbon stock of certain sample plots using the LiDAR method against like the order?
Against telemetry? Yeah. So there's plenty of examples of that in the literature, for example. There's been quite a lot of studies released in the past 3 years in particular showing this. And we did our own study recently up in northern Queensland in a sort of savanna-y environment with eucalypts, where we cut down trees and we then destructively harvested them, and we did our method and we applied allometric models and DBH measurements, and they worked pretty well there. They didn't work as well as the TLS, but they worked quite well. And so that's the thing, is that sometimes that approach can work in, like for eucalypts, for example, they're everywhere. There's massive data sets on them, and so they're quite fairly well calibrated to these models, but they still don't work. They're not as reliable in that sense, and the final product is simply not the same. It's kind of not comparable. But once you get out into the rainforested areas, that's when this starts to the discrepancy starts to grow. Yeah.
Another question? Yep. Oh, sorry, you're up, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking that these devices still need to be carried by human in the middle of the forest. Do you think the next step in this will make it easier, like to be carried by devices?
Well, that's what everyone hopes and wants to do, and would like to cut corners and things like that. But unfortunately, the reality at this point in time is that, like I said, you can have a drone, you can fly a drone over a forest, and that means you don't have to go in that, but you can't fly it in a forest. And if it's over the top of the forest, it means you're not seeing into that forest properly. So you're missing that data. So it's very limited in its use. And even with terrestrial LiDAR, to capture this kind of data, there's other kinds of instruments that are smaller than this and that are lighter than this and easier to carry around, but they don't work as well. They don't collect the same kind of quality of point cloud, which you really need to, if you're trying to get the best product and really make a difference, you kind of need the best equipment, which is what this is, which also happens to be one of the largest and heaviest. And the simple answer is that you can't cut corners at the moment and not have the manual labor element involved, but that's quite heavy, and it is quite heavy to carry by yourself. But there are smaller, newer instruments, which I wanted to bring today, but they're currently being used by our team elsewhere, that are much smaller, much lighter, and much faster and even more powerful. So the instruments may get better and lighter and easier to allow you to move through the forest more easily, but you still need someone to operate them.
You mentioned you're like a biotech company.
Enviro.
Oh, Envirotech.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would a standard team coming out for data collection look like qualification-wise? Like, can people?
Yeah, that's fair. I think I had a slide actually, which I forgot to get to, which was how do you work in this kind of field? So the team itself out in the field, really the process itself is not that dissimilar to unskilled labor in a sense. You simply have to be trained in how to pick up the scanner. There's a different way of doing it before, like you saw in that video. Pick it up, sort of take it to somewhere, click scan, navigate through a forest with a GPS or a compass and look after it and transfer the data off. And that's all quite easy and straightforward. Anyone can do that, really. You just have to be able to carry it. Well, now, when you get to even the data processing itself, taking that raw data and turning it into a point cloud, like you oh yeah, that was the other one I forgot. A point cloud, like you see there. That is something that can be taught to anyone, so long as you're fairly efficient at using a computer and familiar with just capable of learning a sort of mechanistic approach to taking data, clicking a few buttons, performing some sort of manual tasks, etc. It's when you get to the software engineering behind the processes, that's when the expertise gets more. That's when the need for the expertise becomes greater. So as part of our team, we do have some environmental people trained in environmental science. And so familiarity with GIS software like QGIS or ArcGIS is very useful and necessary. It's what we use a lot of the time. And then we have our coding people, our software engineers, who fundamentally transform the data and do most of the analysis and develop the algorithms to turn this into something more useful. But beyond that, there's, like myself, I studied at Monash University in Melbourne. I studied chemistry and economics. This is not, as in so many things, expertise in a certain field can help, but it's not always necessary to get the job that you think you might want, or to end up to get the good job that you didn't yet know that you wanted, to end up somewhere where you'd like to be. If you're someone who's fairly competent, if you can think well, if you can write well, if you can speak well, in that sort of sense, the world in that is kind of at your oyster. It's just a matter of taking the right paths and opportunity and some luck, as it always is. But to do this ground portion part, you don't need a uni degree for that at all. It's where we all started. That's where the company started, but we've now moved beyond that, obviously.
Do you think, Lucien, too, that at this particular point in time, is the application of this technology more in how it is integrated into big regional or national level assessments of native vegetation And then once that data set is sort of built up, that carbon offset developers, for example, get their chunk of area, and then they can use the data that's sort of established at that more macro scale, or at this point in time, can a carbon offset developer come along? You know, given what you said about costs, if they have if it's a 10,000 hectare project in Western Queensland, which has a fairly low yield of carbon per hectare, right, would the costs of this be sort of competitive with the alternative, like the use of full cam in Australia, or with the traditional methods in PNG? So so in other words, is the role in establishing the big databases that individual projects can use, or do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's quite a complex one, actually. But yes, to the first part, in that we are actually working now as a company to establish something like a national database built on our plot network that at different levels of resolution provides biomass information that can be then accessed by your broader scale sort of entities or initiatives, and is subscribed to, and so for the purpose of either checking up on the veracity of claims that other people make, or for your own accounting purposes. And so that's sort of on one side. It's more of a passive approach and less of the carbon sort of offset, immediate demand driven approach. But then when we get to things like what you said, so project specific scenarios in actual carbon projects, whether or not something like that's where the demand for something like this is because carbon projects, they have an immediate need to have their carbon measured. Now, depending where you are and what scheme you're under, that changes. In Australia, for the most part, we use something called full cam, which I think you've talked about somewhat, or
maybe a little bit
familiar with.
A little bit more.
It's just a model that you don't have to measure anything, basically, which, again, is part of the problem, the reason why we have these problems in Australia with our offsetting schemes. Because no one's got any data, and so you can't verify any of the claims that you make. But when the demand is there and the availability of using a measurement-based approach is there, that is where the real utility and entry to market for this technology comes in those offset-based specific project scenarios, though is also directly applicable to things like the National Forest Inventory and PNG, which we are soon to work with to update their own processes and move away from tape measures and more towards something like LiDAR.
Look, everybody, it's 5 to 11. So with that, we might end the session. And can you all put your hands together for that excellent presentation? Like a lot of things we touch on in this course, that's the sort of 5 years' time. This is probably, stock standard, and there's probably those things are probably that big then,
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much.